Hey guys, we are starting off with a new chapter called probability. Let's define probability. It is the measure of likelihood of an event, which means it tells you what are the chances of an event happening. For example, let's say we have a coin, and we know that a coin has two sides to it, heads and tails. And we want to know what are the chances or what is the probability of getting heads. Well, we know there are two sides. There's an equally likely chance of getting heads and an equally likely chance of getting tails. And so we can also say that the probability or the chances of getting heads is 50% and the chances of getting tails is also 50%. And what is 50% in decimals? We write it this way. The probability of getting tails is 0.5, which is basically equivalent to 50%. And the probability of getting heads is also 50%, which can be written the same way as 0.5. Now let's come back to the definition of probability. It says the measure of likelihood of an event. What is an event? An event is an outcome or a set of outcomes of interest. When we were looking at our heads and tails example of flipping a coin, our outcome of interest was getting a head. Let's say we were not looking at the probability of getting a tail. All we cared about was getting what is the probability of getting a head, which was 0.5. Heads is our event and it is our outcome of interest. But what does this mean? A set of outcomes of interest. Well, let's say we have a dice, a 6-faced dice. And the question is that what is the probability of getting an odd number? What is the probability of getting an odd number? Well, in this case, there is not just one event you're looking at. There is not just one outcome you're looking at. You are looking at a set of outcomes. You care about getting a 1 or a 3 or a 5 because all three of these are odd numbers. So this is your set of outcomes of interest and the probability of getting an odd number is your event. So in this case, you need to see what is the probability of getting a 1. Well, it is 1 upon 6 because out of 6 numbers, you have a chance of getting 1, or plus, as you remember from our notations in the previous chapter, what is the probability of getting a 3? Well, there's another 1 upon 6 chance of getting a 3 because out of 6 numbers, you only have 1, 3. Or, what is the chance of getting a 5? It is 1 upon 6. So your probability of getting an odd number, you can also write it like this. Probability of getting an odd number is 3 upon 6, which is 1 upon 2. And now coming to the last definition, sample space. What is a sample space? A sample space is a set of all possible outcomes. An event is a subset of the sample space. Okay, so we know what probability is. We know that an event talks about the outcome or a set of outcomes of your interest, whereas a sample space is a set of all possible outcomes. So looking at our heads and tails example, we have two possible outcomes. So we write our sample space this way. Our sample space has two possible outcomes, which is h, t, which implies that heads and tails are two possible outcomes for this experiment. Now, what about this example? We have a 6-faced die, and what are all our possible outcomes when we're rolling the dice? Well, this is how we're going to write our sample space. Our sample space comprises of getting a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5, or a 6. So this is our sample space. So to conclude, we have looked at 3 major definitions of this chapter. Probability, which is simply measuring the likelihood of an event happening. What is an event? It is the outcome or the set of outcomes of your interest. It is what you are interested in finding the probability of. And sample space gives you all possible outcomes when you're carrying out an experiment. So if you ever need to find the probability of an event happening, you need to divide the number of outcomes of your interest by the total number of outcomes. So for example, in the heads and tails example, the number of outcomes of interest, let's say if we were finding the probability of heads, we had one outcome of interest, but there were two outcomes in total, and therefore it was 1 upon 2. Same way for the 6-faced dice, if we need to find the probability of the total number of outcomes of your interest, we had 3 outcomes of interest. Our outcomes of interest was 1, 3, or 5. So we had 3 outcomes of interest, so you could simply just say 3. And how many outcomes were there in total? There were 6 outcomes in total. So whether you find them all individually or whether you find them all together, it is the same thing. It will give you the same probability.